I'm Father Miitch, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from around the world. And tonight, we'll learn about Eastern Catholic churches, particularly in Ukraine. We'll talk about the life and mission of Venerable Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky. But first, we want to talk briefly with EWTN's Jim Pinto about what the EWTN media missionaries are doing. Jim, what's going on with the missionaries?
Always great to be with you.
Thank
Same thing going on with the media missionaries. We just need more media missionaries. That's why I'm here, to invite people to be a part. EWTN media missionaries keep in sight EWTN.
Yep.
That's what we do. We equip people to do that. Free material. You do this in written form. You do it electronically. Keep EWTN in sight. Why? Because EWTN keeps in sight Jesus Christ.
Right.
And the Holy Catholic Church. One way we do that is when you join EWTN, we send you periodically posters. These posters are absolutely beautiful by our creative services, graphic designs. We want you to post them anywhere you can on your church campus or beyond the church campus publicly. Posters like EWTN is everywhere, all the ways you could connect with EWTN. I think that has your picture on it, that one. So I got that one, especially so you can keep me on for a few more minutes here.
Sure.
So all the ways.
Won't work. I'm from Chicago. I deal with bribes. Go ahead.
TV, radio, print form, all the ways you can connect, smartphones, whatever it is, EWTN's everywhere. We have pro-life posters, which is so important right now. So much conversation about pro-life, pro-choice, abortion. What does the church teach? What do we believe? Programming that we have. Pro-Life Weekly. And so to post that around your campus, there in the parish, publicly, so that people can be informed. Kids posters, that's our latest poster that we sent out. Beautifully done, colorful. You just can't walk by it, you gotta look. All of our programming for kids. And just parents are looking for this, looking for something that kids could watch, be catechized. You can walk away from the TV set, you don't have to worry. EWTN provides all of this. And then we have seasonal posters like Christmas and Lent and Easter, the week that changed the world, and just a stark picture of the crown of thorns. Boy, if this is posted someplace, people just don't walk by a crown of thorns. Just like, oh, what is this about? What's happening? What's it? And then it has all the information on EWTN, how you contact EWTN, what the show is. And so we want you to join the media missionaries so we can send you these and other material like the highlights. These are great too, so they're not posters that you post, but you just kind of hand them out, all about EWTN. Keep EWTN in sight. In sight, in mind, out of sight, out of mind. There's some people that only you can reach for Christ and for the church.
I travel around a lot in the country, and even though EWTN reaches 400 million homes plus, a lot of people in this country still don't know. So this is important. You can go to the EWTNmissionaries.com, or you can also call their number, 205-795-5771, or email us at EWTNmissionaries@EWTN.com. Thank you, Jim.
You, Father.
Appreciate you being with us and letting us know about this. And we'll be back in just a couple minutes with our guests, so please stay with us. Welcome back. Tonight we have a guest who is a deacon in the Kyiv Archeparchy of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. An archeparchy is the same thing as in the Roman diocese as an archdiocese. In the Eastern Church, it's called an eparchy instead of a diocese. He is a professor of liturgy at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome. And tonight, he'll be sharing with us about the extraordinary life and ministry of Venerable Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky, who had guided the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church through 2 world wars and 7 political regimes. Joining us from our EWTN studios in Cologne, Germany, please welcome Deacon Daniel Galadza. Father Deacon Daniel, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much, Father. Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen. It's good to have you with us. And first of all, to understand, to help our audience understand that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is part of the Byzantine part of the Catholic Church. Is that not correct?
That's right, yeah. So the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, or perhaps as it's known in the United States and Canada, Ukrainian Catholic Church, is one of the many, over 20 churches that are part of the Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church, of course, is the largest of the churches of the Catholic Church, the Universal Church, accounting for probably 99% of faithful worldwide. But the Ukrainian Greek Catholic or Ukrainian Catholic Church is the largest of the Eastern Catholic churches, with its, one could say, kind of home territory in present-day Ukraine and also in Eastern Europe, but now, through the circumstances of history, with faithful and also bishops and their eparchies, which is same as dioceses, as you mentioned, throughout the world, almost on every continent.
Yes, and it's a very important church because the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I believe, is the largest of the Eastern churches in the Catholic Church, correct?
That's right, yeah. So it's the largest of all the Eastern Catholic churches, and it's also the largest of the Byzantine Rite. So there are many rites. Apart from the Roman Rite, there's the Byzantine Rite. There are traditions that are Alexandrian, so the Coptic Christians, or Armenian, or various Syrian traditions, so Maronites, or Syro-Malabars, or Syro-Malankar Catholic Christians.
Right, right. A lot of our audience is familiar that I have bi-ritual faculties with the Maronites, who are part of that Syrian tradition. And any Catholic can go to any one of these Eastern churches and receive the sacraments, that they're always welcome. And I want to encourage people to do so. It's important to see, as Pope St. John Paul had frequently said, from early in his pontificate, his second encyclical, that we need to see the church breathing with both of its lungs. This is a very important part of the church. One of the things I also would like people to understand is that the last century, the 20th century, was the time of greatest persecution in the history of the church. Out of the 75 million martyrs in the history of the church, 40 million were killed in the 20th century alone. And of that 40 million, the majority were in the eastern part of the church. This is where the atheism, socialism, and communism slammed like a storm against the shore of the church and pummeled the people, killing tens of millions of people in Eastern Europe, and then in some parts of the Oriental Church in Western Asia and Central Asia. So this is a very important part of the history of the Eastern Church, martyrdom.
Yes, exactly, Father. And that's why I'm very thankful to be able to talk about the life of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky, who was the pastor of a church that experienced both of these world wars of the 20th century and was caught between Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, caught also on the front lines between East and West, also in terms of the Christian tradition.
First of all, tell us a little bit about his life. When was he born and where did he live?
So he was born on July 29th, 1865 in what is today presently Western Ukraine. At the time it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into a noble family of, one could say, Ruthenian heritage. So one could say perhaps Polonized Ukrainians who at home, because they were a noble family, they had noble titles, they spoke French. He had ancestors who were archbishops of Lviv, Greek Catholic, so Eastern Catholic bishops of Lviv in Western Ukraine, also known as Lwów in Polish, or Lemberg in German, a city that really is a meeting place of various cultures and languages. And so he was born into this family, one of 7 sons, the 3rd son, and the first son to survive beyond the teenage years. He had also one brother that became a general in the Austrian and the Polish army. So they found themselves in a way on different sides of the Second World, of the time in the interwar period. And another of his brothers, his younger brother, Kazimir, who became a monk later on and was his closest collaborator, an assistant later on in life. So he had, one could say, the first half of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky's life reads like a hagiography. Born into a noble family, very pious family. His mother wrote about his childhood, how all the sons would pray the rosary and fall asleep with the rosary on their fingers. And they all received an excellent education. Metropolitan Andrey studied law, just as some of his other brothers, in Krakow, in Poland. And he was able to undertake trips to Rome, even to the Russian Empire, where he met the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. He even had a private audience with his family with Pope Leo XIII, at which time he told the Pope about his desire to enter upon monastic life and in the Byzantine rite. Even though he was baptized as a Roman Catholic and brought up in the Roman Catholic Church, he felt this longing to rediscover the traditions of his ancestors and entered the Basilian order, which at the time was the only monastic order in what is now called the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And it was around that time reformed by the Jesuits, so it united a contemplative and an active apostolate. So they were very much involved in education.
And as you mentioned,
later on, he was chosen as.
I was just going to say that as you mentioned,
he was chosen
these
as
things,
bishop at the age of 35.
Okay, I was just going to say that as you mentioned these things, it would be worth it for people to go back and understand the history of this period, because this is, he's got people in his brothers in the Polish army, the Austrian army, and it's just what was going on. And for folks to understand in that time is the empires of Europe were doing body slams against each other and breaking down all of their empires. So by the end of the World War, the First World War, the Russian Empire, it becomes Soviet Union. The Austro-Hungarian Empire loses having an emperor. Poland didn't exist before that, but then after the war, Poland does exist. New countries like Czechoslovakia come into being. This is great turmoil that didn't really settle down for until relatively recently, and even still, and we'll talk about this later, the present war going on between Russia and Ukraine is the ongoing saga of these empires, falling apart and reforming, and so it's worth knowing history so that you can see the context in which someone like Venerable Sheptytsky could be placed. So that's why he was Roman Catholic. Lviv was Poland. In fact, my family saved a Jewish family from Lviv, but later on it became part of Ukraine. So, because it's mostly Ukrainian people. So, continue on about this background.
That's right. Yeah, thank you, Father, for pointing that out. The episcopate of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky, he was first a bishop in what was then called Stanislavov or Stanislaviv, and today is Ivano-Frankivsk, a town in western Ukraine. He was their bishop for 14 months before he was elected, appointed Metropolitan of Lviv, so Archbishop, the most senior cleric for all Greek Catholics in the Habsburg Empire at the time. And he was the pastor of his flock at the beginning, when they were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this was an opportunity to really help the church flourish. He would establish theological associations, theological schools, caring for the education of the clergy. At the same time, he cared about the well-being of his flock with education in villages and various societies promoting agriculture and reading and education in the villages. Also patron of the arts, being a member of the nobility, he was able to fund museums, be a patron of artists, rediscover iconography, and promote contact also with Orthodox Christians, which at the time was not so common. Today we talk about ecumenism, but he was really a pioneer on that front. And of course, all this changes with the First World War, when the Russian Empire, the Russian army invades Lviv, his episcopal see, and he is actually taken prisoner for 3 years in the Russian Empire. And he's held there in prison in a monastery, and he's able actually to communicate with some of his clergy in kind of secret means by sending icons with inscriptions on the back of them indicating that he's alive. And after the conclusion of the First World War and his release, he was able to make visits to the United States, Canada, and even South America to visit his flock, which had been spread throughout the world, both before and during the First World War. So the opportunities that were there during the Austro-Hungarian Empire really were, it became a completely different situation. One already had the experience of persecution during the First World War, kind of a foretaste of what was to come during the Second World War, with much greater persecution, with monks and nuns and priests being exiled and murdered. One has to remember that at that time, what is present-day Ukraine was caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. On September 1st, 1939, the Soviet army came into Lviv and occupied Western Ukraine for 2 years. And so during this time, the Greek Catholic Church was persecuted. Women's monasteries, convents were closed down, and lots of the population was either imprisoned or sent into exile in the Soviet Union. So he is a complex figure because caring for his flock, he tried to do everything possible to help them survive and to preach the gospel, preach peace in a time of war. That's why then in 1941, when the Germans arrived, the Nazi Germany attacked Soviet Russia, initially he welcomed them as liberators, which it took him a few months to realize what was going on, this persecution of Jewish people and the concentration camps. Once this information came to his he came into this information, he then wrote letters directly to Himmler and Hitler condemning this, and he's actually one of the few Catholic hierarchs that during the Second World War wrote directly to the Nazi German authorities to condemn this. And meanwhile, he was saving the children of rabbis in Lviv and in Galicia in western Ukraine from concentration camps, from their murder and torture. And in fact, today we know of many cases of Jewish children being saved in the network of monasteries that Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky had created, the Studite Fathers. And for example, the chief rabbi of the Israeli Air Force, Rabbi David Kahane, was one of the children that was saved by Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky. The same thing with Adam Daniel Rotfeld, Foreign Affairs Minister of Poland, and all this is documented in the biography of Kurt Levin, who was able to flee to Israel and then to the United States, and was actually one of the witnesses at the beginning of the beatification process of Metropolitan Andrey in 1958 in Rome.
Mm-hmm. And again, to help situate this, when Lviv, as we mentioned, was part of Poland, and in the famous agreement between Germany and Soviet Union, Nazi Germany and Soviet Union, they had agreed to divide Poland up. So the communists took eastern Poland, the Germans invaded western Poland, and they divided up, and this was the collapse of the brand new Polish country. It just fell apart with two invaders, but it was a crisis for the Catholics in what was then eastern Poland, western Ukraine. In addition, I think it's very important to understand how vicious the Soviet communists had been to the people of Ukraine in general. They had already starved over 6 million people to death in Ukraine. They tried to destroy the system of private farms by starving the farmers to death, taking their grain and their seed grain and leaving them with nothing, and they just died. So this was a major famine going on, and when the Germans did invade, it was perceived as an improvement over the Soviets, given this mass starvation that had been going on in the 1920s and 30s under communist rule. Is that not correct?
Exactly, exactly. So it's almost an impossible situation, being stuck between a rock and a hard place, knowing that the Stalin regime in the Soviet Union had taken away the grain of numerous people in central and eastern Ukraine in the 1930s in what is called the Holodomor, this famine genocide. Mm-hmm. So people in western Ukraine, being under Polish rule, were living in relative peace and comfort at the time. So seeing the Soviets flee was a welcome sign. But at the same time, in this transition, in between the fronts, we have numerous examples of clergy and laity being murdered viciously and brutally. All of this is very similar to what we hear in the headlines in the last few months during this war in Ukraine. People being, monks, for example, in the town of Drohobych in western Ukraine, being boiled alive, or some crucified on walls, really barbaric torture at the hands of the Soviets. At the same time, then, very zealous pastors, for example, the blessed Emilian Koch, priest who had studied in Rome. He was a married priest. He was very much involved in charitable work in his parishes. He then was taken prisoner in a German concentration camp at Majdanek, and despite the opportunity to be released, he stayed with the imprisoned there because he said this is where he can really fulfill his ministry as a priest to those people most in need. So really horrible death and suffering coming from both sides, and
Yes.
many of these confessors and martyrs have been beatified by St. John Paul II during his visit to Ukraine in 2001.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I helped do a documentary on Blessed Vasil Velichkovsky, who had been a prisoner in concentration camps and given some of the poisons that later on the Russian Federation used against their enemies. This continued on as a horrible experience. And I know that there was some criticism of Venerable Sheptytsky for welcoming the Germans, but when they came, they tried to portray themselves as liberator of the persecuted people. What they didn't realize is that within a year or so of their invasion of Ukraine, they would then start executing the Jewish people, just lining them up in ditches and machine gunning them. Even the Nazis who did that, the machine guns, they went crazy themselves. That's why they later on started the gas chambers, because it was too horrific even for the Nazis. Some of the soldiers actually doing the crime. And so, between, again, the National Socialists, the Nazis, and the Communists, this destruction was part of, the mass execution of people by atheistic governments.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the barbarity of the Second World War that really was felt many times in the Archeparchy of Lviv when Metropolitan Andrey was the bishop there. And seeing the threat of further persecution, he prepared the church very well for survival during the period of communist persecution, which lasted from the second arrival of the Soviet army in 1944 in Lviv until 1989, when the church was able to come out of the catacombs, so to speak, from persecution, and was able to be legalized again. Because having seen the imprisonment in the Russian Empire and having had 2 years of Soviet persecution and also these years of German Nazi occupation, Metropolitan Andrey had already ordained his successor, who would later become Cardinal Joseph Sleepy, already back in 1939 in December, after a few years of Soviet persecution. And his biography is well known in the West, particularly because the similarities of his life to the fictional character of Archbishop Lakota from Morris West's The Shoes of the Fisherman is so close that I've heard this anecdotally, that when journalists would ask Cardinal Joseph Sleepy about his 17 years in Soviet gulags. He was there from 1945 until his release during the Second Vatican Council with the aid of American President John F. Kennedy and Pope John XXIII. Journalists would ask, is it true that the biography, the story, the novel, the movie, The Shoes of the Fisherman is about you? And he would say, no, this is fiction. And then later on, they would ask details. How was it there in the Soviet imprisonment in the gulags? And he would say, well, just read The Shoes of the Fisherman. It's all in there. So that's a fictionalized version of explaining that persecution. But his memoirs of his life from his birth in the late 19th century in Western Ukraine until his release from Soviet imprisonment when he gets on the train in Moscow in the 1960s to return to Rome. Is really, it goes through all these events that you've mentioned, the Austro-Hungarian rule in what is today Western Ukraine, Polish rule, the Russian invasion, Soviet and German invasion after 17 years of imprisonment. So Metropolitan Andrey handpicked him as his successor as a bright young theology student who studied in Innsbruck and was later rector of the seminary and would later on become the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and recognized as a cardinal by the Holy See. And there are many other such stories of confessors of the faith who were prepared and for their ministry by the example of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky.
Father Deacon, we need to take a little break. We'll be back in just a minute, but I just want to let our audience know that if you want more information about Venerable Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky, you can go to the Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky Institute online. It is sheptytskyinstitute.ca. And Sheptytsky is SHEPTYTSKY institute.ca. And don't any of you complain about the name being difficult. They have more vowels per in ratio to consonants than we Polish people do. So you're really doing pretty well with that name. So look that up. We'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Please stay with us. We are speaking with Deacon Daniel Galadza of the Kiev Archeparchy of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And we're talking about Venerable Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky and his life and heroism in an extraordinarily difficult set of circumstances. As we mentioned at the beginning, 7 different regimes, the Austro-Hungarian, Polish, Soviet, and then Nazi, then back to the Soviets. All of these different governments have come and gone over through his life. And, it's also important to understand something, and Father Deacon Daniel, I'd like you to address this. It's the issue of the way the KGB, which was the communist secret police in the Soviet Union, the way they had manipulated the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church. They had been very much using clergy as agents. And how did that have any effect on the Greek Catholics in Ukraine?
Oh yes, of course. The end of the life of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky is connected with this question. He died on November 1st, 1944, when the Soviet army had already entered Lviv for the second time after driving out Nazi Germany. And even though it was in the interests of the Soviet government and also of the Russian Orthodox Church to liquidate the Greek Catholic Church because it wasn't willing to collaborate with the Soviet authorities. They had waited until Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky had died to make any moves because they understood that he was such a great moral authority, not only in the church, but in general in society, and not just among Ukrainians, but among all of society. So they waited until after his death to begin kind of smear campaigns, even though they would acknowledge his work to save Jewish children and his attempts to save his flock in the horrors, during the horrors of war. But it was then soon after his death, so the next year, that the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Union, rounded up all the bishops of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and sent them to Soviet prisons, first for interrogation and then later on to gulags for hard labor throughout the Soviet Union. And some of them died very quickly, and some of them have been beatified, as I mentioned, by Pope John Paul II in 2001, and some survived. Cardinal Joseph Sleepy, Blessed Basil Velichkovsky, or Vasil Velichkovsky, whose relics are in Winnipeg in Canada. So the KGB involvement there with the arrest of the clergy, the bishops of the Ukrainian Catholic Church was crucial. But then 1 year later, there was an attempt to liquidate the whole church. So the KGB, in a way, forced the Russian Orthodox Church to organize a church council. One could put it in quotation marks because there were no Catholic bishops present, and yet the Russian Orthodox Church at the time, even though it was compromised by the Soviet government and forced to collaborate with the secret police of the Soviet Union, now archival documents show that the head of their church at the time, Patriarch Alexei I, did not want to convene this council. He said that it would be better to just have individual parishes or individual priests convert one at a time. But the Soviet government wanted a triumphal show of victory over the Greek Catholic Church, and so they organized very cynically on the Sunday of Orthodoxy, the first Sunday of Lent in the Byzantine tradition, which is actually about the veneration of icons and proper understanding of Christology, so the Orthodox faith, and not about confessional orthodoxy. They organized this pseudo-sobor, as many popes have called it, since it was convened in 1946, and anyone who refused to join the Russian Orthodox Church was then arrested, sent to hard labor in Siberia, among them many monks, diocesan priests, and also many married priests who went with their families as well. And so it was this period from 1946 until 1989 that the church was considered illegal in the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the church was, in the eyes of its faithful and its clergy, and in the eyes of the Catholic Church throughout the world, was not ever liquidated. It continued to serve in the catacombs, and there are many examples of secret divine liturgies being celebrated in private homes, even clandestine seminaries and monasteries functioning and evading arrest from the KGB, or sometimes these priests, these monks and nuns would be arrested and nevertheless survived this period of persecution.
In fact, I had found out that Cardinal Sleepy had consecrated Blessed Vasil Velichkovsky secretly, along with other bishops, and he had, consecrated him a bishop in a hotel room in Moscow right before he went to Rome. And these kind of, secret masses and the use of raisins that were fermented so that they could have wine to celebrate this liturgy, even in the prison camps, the gulag camps. These kind of, the heroism needs to be better understood, by, what people went through. And seeing this, when we worry about, a few riots and things like that going here, and we hear threats against Catholic churches because of our pro-life stance, this is nothing compared to what happened to the Christians in Eastern Europe, and particularly Catholics. This was, the Greek Catholics in particular. It's very important to understand this history and see what courage looks like among bishops, priests, monks, nuns, and lay people who suffered so much.
That's right, yeah. And now we have a lot more information about this from both archival material that was opened up in Ukraine, very briefly in Russia, because it was closed soon after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. We have many autobiographies and memoirs that explain what life was like in the catacombs. There are examples, like you said, about these clandestine liturgies, priests even having to use basic household items as a chalice and a paten, so an espresso cup and the little plate, and this would be their chalice and their paten. Even examples of the heroic Metropolitan Volodymyr Sternyuk, a Redemptorist who was then head of the church in Ukraine for a time in the period of the persecution, where they would use their glasses. They would use one side as a chalice and one side as a paten to consecrate the Eucharist, and use their bodies as altars. And this is something we hear about in the lives of the saints in the early church. So it's really incredible, as you mentioned earlier, this connection between the early church and the 20th century, this time of persecution.
And there's one of my Jesuit brothers who had been a missionary in what was then Eastern Poland when he arrived, Western Ukraine, as a Greek Catholic, wrote a wonderful book called With God in Russia. To read that and see what it was like as an American in that circumstance of communism and the Nazis and such, and then to read Solzhenitsyn, and to read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, or one of the other books like Gulag Archipelago. These books will give people a sense. Our schools in the United States are no longer teaching these things because there's more sympathy for some of the socialist and even Marxist perspectives. And false histories like Howard Zinn, on American that are open to these things. So it's neglected. We have to take it on ourselves to understand what this meant and what we can learn from these heroes of faith.
That's right. The example of Father Walter Cizik is one that is thankfully well known in the West because, as you said, he was American-born, if I'm not mistaken, and wrote in English. These other biographies are, they still need to be translated, whether it's the biography, the memoirs of Cardinal Joseph Slipy, or the accounts of the heroic life of the brother of Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky, Blessed Clement or Clementi Sheptytsky, who was a Studite monk in that order of monks that Metropolitan Andrey Sheptytsky revived at the beginning of the 20th century. These really moving stories of how he celebrated Easter, for example, in a Soviet prison in 1951, before his execution on May 1st, 1951, where he received a care package with some apples and shared them with the other prisoners rather than just eating them himself, where they were underfed and without any ability to celebrate the Divine Liturgy or to attend church services. This sharing even of these apples were seen as this sharing of the joy of the resurrection. And many of these people that had endured such incredible and unbelievable suffering, whether it's Father Walter Cizik or Blessed Clemente Sheptytsky. Those who saw them saw that they really radiated almost this kind of light and had this extreme peace even in the times of great persecution and war. It's unbelievable. It's hard to imagine in today's world.
Yeah, I actually met another one of my Jesuit brothers who had been in a communist prison in China. And his mother sent him a care package with Necco candy, which is American candy. It's sort of a chocolate, sugary wafer kind of thing, but not real chocolate. But at any rate, in between each Necco, she put a host. So he was then sent him a little medicine bottle with wine in it. He used the cap as his chalice and consecrated a host and broke it into as tiny pieces as good so he could give communion to his brother priests in the prison. And these stories of what it was like under atheism and communism and socialism, again, we have to know those. Now, let me move up to something more contemporary. We just have a few minutes, and I know that here in the United States, we are very, very concerned about the horrendous suffering that's going on. Europe has been at peace, except for the former Yugoslavia, until now. And then this winter, we see Europeans break out in another war, a horrible war, between Russia, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine. How are things now in Ukraine? What's going on that you can report to us, especially from the perspective of the Greek Catholic Church?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Father. From the perspective of the Greek Catholic Church, we've never forgotten that time of persecution during the Soviet era, and so the ability to serve divine liturgies for soldiers on the front or people in bomb shelters is something that actually the older clergy have personal experience with, and the younger clergy have learned through the reading memoirs or hearing the edifying stories from the older clergy. So during the first wave of bombing in Kyiv, even a student of mine at the Kyiv seminary, who is now a priest, pictures of him serving a divine liturgy in a bunker, I think were circulated very widely over the internet. They went viral, so to speak. So the need to be grounded in Christ and the gospel is something that is always present before the eyes of all the faithful, the clergy, the monks and nuns, and the bishops of the Greek Catholic Church. And this understanding of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, as it was in the 20th century, between various oppressive and opposing powers, is something that is remembered to this day. And despite the difficulties and the suffering that is encountered today in Ukraine, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, His Beatitude Sviatoslav, always reminds the faithful in daily messages to continue praying, to remember the joy of the resurrection, and that the truth of God, the truth of Christ, will always overcome and has already overcome. And so this gives the faithful hope. And for viewers in the West, perhaps they can understand the situation of the faithful in Ukraine, that it's often very difficult to find good allies because one is the faithful in Ukraine are trying to be faithful to the Catholic Church, to the gospel, to the teachings of the Church, and in a time of war, when some faithful are being murdered, and this is being documented, it's just horrific, to nevertheless remember that one must remain in the love of Christ, to love one's neighbor, and to forgive wrongdoing. It's extremely difficult, but it's part of being tested in the faith.
And it's important to understand that on one hand, there is legitimate self-defense by the people of Ukraine against an unjust invasion. And it's possible for a Catholic to stand up and defend their country, their family, and their own lives. But at the same time, one may not hate the enemy who does the oppression, because at that point, you go down to their level. You don't want to let the evil that is done to you make you part of the evil as well. You want to, again, rightfully defend yourself and do so well, and at the same time, love your enemy with hopes that they have a conversion away from this evil. That's our goal. Would that not be the mentality of the Greek church?
Exactly, Father. And on the church front, it's also very difficult because Ukraine is a country that probably the majority of the population is Orthodox, and within Ukraine, the faithful Greek Catholics and Orthodox generally live in peace. The Greek Catholic Church has tried to, turn the other cheek, to ask for forgiveness and to work towards reconciliation, even with the Russian Orthodox Church. After the Greek Catholic Church was liquidated in the Soviet Union in 1946, there were efforts, particularly in the 90s then the 2000s, to have some sort of reconciliation, but unfortunately nothing has really come about with that on any official level. But nevertheless, it's crucial to be reminded of loving God with one's whole heart, mind, and soul, and also loving one's neighbor. And what does that mean? Who is our neighbor?
Well, Father Deacon Daniel, we have to go. I'm afraid we're running out of time. I want people to know that they can go to the Ukrainian Catholic Crisis Media Center, which is uccmc.org, to find out more information about what's ongoing war. And may the Lord bless you and all of our viewers, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, Father Deacon, for being with us. I want to thank all of our viewers. This network is brought to you by you. We can do this kind of interview from our studios in Germany because of the support that you give us. So keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll pay our bills too. God bless you and thank you.